Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, Calculating Success, Use Workplace Analytics to Revitalize Your Organization. I'm Lisa Burrell, a Senior Editor at HBR. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Workday for making this discussion possible. We really want this to be an interactive webinar, so if you have questions or comments at any time, just click on the question icon in the lower right section of your screen and send those in during the presentation. We'll do our Q&A at the end. The presentation materials for today's webinar are available to download through the double links icon in the lower right area of your viewing window. We also have a conversation taking place on Twitter. You can find us at HBR Exchange and use the hashtag HBRWebinar. Now for a few words about today's presentation. Most companies today have access to reams of data, yet research shows that they don't put all that information to effective use. There's too much of it, and it's too messy. While executives know the results they need to achieve, they often fail to analyze the impact of their decisions on the firm's processes, people, and performance. In the book Calculating Success, Carl Hoffmann and his co-authors explain how to make better, more targeted use of human capital data. Today, he will talk about how executives can use workforce analytics to make smarter strategic decisions and improve business results. He'll share his 6-step framework and a case study that illustrates how this approach can lead to a more motivated and more cost-efficient workforce. For more than 30 years, he's been helping companies around the world to formulate and implement effective HR strategies that support their business goals. Formerly a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers and then at IBM, he has established a private consulting firm, Human Capital Management and Performance, where he continues to work with executives to make fact-based decisions and integrate workforce activities with line operations. He is the lead author of Calculating Success, a new book on organization and workforce analytics published by Harvard Business Press in January 2012. Dr. Hoffmann, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Harvard Business Press, for inviting me to give this webinar and the audience for spending an hour listening to me. I know your time is precious, and I hope to make it worthwhile. The agenda for today's conversation is to define workplace analytics and basically to look at it as being very distinctive. It deals directly with a full range of business issues. People sell products, people build products, people design products that are to be sold, and people basically provide the glue to keep the company together and moving forward. Workforce analytics is holistic. In order to understand what's going on in your organization, you have to consider a range of factors, not just the workers and who they are and what they need, but also the tools that they use, the environment that they work in, the structure of the work, and how they are managed and measured. And finally, it deals with finding cause and taking action. No amount of research or analysis is worth anything unless it can be acted on, and acted on with a surety and meeting the business needs that are required of it. Our critical areas of focus, which we'll go over several times today, and the areas of discussion are basically the organization, how one designs the organization very effectively, how one populates that organization and through a human capital supply chain, how one gets engagement from the workers there, and really this is the focus on management. How does management use its tools effectively to lead those workers, to get them committed to what the company needs, and to use the tools in the organization effectively to meet the organization's needs. And then finally, innovation. Innovation is never ending. It happens continuously. Markets change, the workforce changes, and so there has to be continuous adjustment. And finally, we'll touch a bit on big data at the end of the presentation and contrast a little bit about what big data is writing about and how it tackles large databases and the approach that we take in the book and in this presentation. So how is it distinctive? I think that for me, workforce analytics really does focus on the business. You'll hear me talk a great deal today about organization, about human capital supply chain, and about management and innovation. Very little about compensation or turnover analysis or engagement surveys. Those are all in service to those four larger areas that I talked about. One of my favorite ratios is to look at the total cost of labor and total revenue. Those are two very simple metrics that when you put them in a ratio have some nice characteristics that I like a lot. First, it is focused. These are key metrics, and you can't get away from them. You can't escape the amount of money that the company is making, and you can't escape the cost of the capital that's producing the goods that produces finally the revenue. So it connects them directly, and I like that a lot. It's dynamic. It basically forces management to look at two sides of an equation, which is either increasing revenue or decreasing the total cost of labor, or doing both through increased productivity. It requires shared responsibility. It forces human resources, finance, operations, and marketing and sales to partner in dealing with this dynamic. Because it basically says we're all in this together. We all need more revenue, and we all need a more productive workforce. And finally, there's a very creative tension involved here. It basically says that the ratio can be solved in many different ways. And the key to analytics is understanding how human capital management can affect both labor costs and revenue. Too often, though, we take a simplistic view of this ratio, and we really focus much more on seeing revenue as fixed and labor cost is a variable, and inevitably the variable is to reduce it. Instead of looking at the ratio and saying, can I increase revenue and therefore hold labor costs out more effectively? And so when you take the view that labor costs are the variable, you could become very absorbed in an accounting view of the world. So you look at contractors versus temporaries. You look at, or full-time versus part-time. You look at technology substitutions for headcount. You look at workers in developed countries versus emerging countries. And then you look very much on salaries, the cost of acquiring or recruiting someone, the cost of training an employee, the workspace and the environment that they work in and how much that's costing, the overhead to support those people, and finally the regulatory costs. And then the labor components come down even further, where not only are you looking at acquisition, you're looking at the cost of divestitures. So if you're in France, when you look at labor costs this way, they're a lot more expensive because of the amount of money that you'll have to spend if you want to divest yourselves of workers than they would even in the United States. And so the game becomes almost, how can I account for these things and shift them around more effectively? And a huge amount of financial analysis is done on the labor force to look at hourly rates and to reduce all of the component costs of labor. HR also becomes part of this because they now focus on base salaries, on computing bonuses, on how stock options are done, on controlling training costs, on recruiting and selecting people more effectively, and how can the company migrate to cheaper markets. If they do become involved, and many of them are, and the revenue side of it, they look at performance management as a silo. So let's develop a performance management program. or let's develop programs to acquire and manage talent more effectively. How can we engage the workforce more effectively? But those seem like very narrow focuses that don't necessarily connect directly with the revenue mechanism. And frankly, no matter what you do to those other characteristics that we've just described, workers still have to fulfill customers' needs. They have to provide excellence in customer service. They have to be highly productive and meet standards of quality. Yet even here we become too simplistic because oftentimes we just focus on the individual and their performance and their capabilities as opposed to the performance of the overall organization. So what are the critical focus areas? They are total cost of labor and total revenue, divided by total revenue. But we also want to now look at how those workers can be better organized to increase total revenue and increase profit margin. We want to then populate that organization with highly capable and motivated people who are interested in doing that work effectively and who will sustain that effort over time. They have to be managed effectively in order to obtain that engagement and commitment. And managers have got to be provided tools to motivate them, to develop them, and to get the work done. And then finally, when all of that wonderfully designed effort falls apart because of changes in markets or financial conditions, the workforce has got to innovate. The organization has to change, the supply chain has to alter, and the management techniques have to be different. So what I'd like to do now is kind of go into a process and a story that basically is a case study. It's a case study that actually involves a low-margin retail store, and I think that we're all familiar with them. Low wages, which leads to high turnover, a poorly trained workforce because they're always new, or they're not very engaged, and they also have high absenteeism. This leads to, and it necessitates, a hierarchy of managers who are constantly reacting to the chaos. They're filling in for absent workers, both literally, they're substituting their own wages and work for those workers who are missing, but also they're scrambling to fill places for workers that are scheduled and who aren't showing up effectively. They're hiring replacements to replace those people. They're training replacements. More likely than not, they're just telling them what to do as opposed to training them. And they're dealing with mistakes and excessive administrative duties that are caused by the chaos. This in turn leads to dirty stores, poor merchandising, bad customer service, long lines at checkout. Finally, lower sales and lost revenue, and then finally pressure to lower hourly wages or reduce headcount. This is a not virtuous cycle at all. But one of the things that workforce analytics does is to provide a way of looking at that chaos and trying to escape from it. And it provides a disciplined process of research and analysis to get this done. So that's the basic question. And then the concept is, how can we build a business model to provide a better service, increase sales, and hire and retain a quality professional staff required to do those first two things? That then gets translated into a data collection process that basically says, what are my workers spending their time on now? So if we go back to that previous slide, what we're looking at is managers who are spending excessive amounts of time not managing, and hourly workers who are not really engaged in doing the things that need to be done to succeed. So if we can grab those activities and understand how much time and effort is being placed on them and what our investment is in getting that done, we can analyze that information. And we can eliminate things that people shouldn't be doing at all in the store. We might be able to automate aspects of the job, for instance, the manager's scheduling and tracking of labor. And we could reorganize it so we could centralize it, some of that activity, perhaps hiring and training. We could, into a skilled HR function, we could push down some of the management activities to a lower level. And if we did that, maybe we could achieve the following and model it effectively. So we could model the new organizations and basically look at seeing if we could achieve a much smaller manager group and save a lot of money from the managers group and distribute that to another area, perhaps more capable department heads that can take over some of those managers' roles and some of the training aspects within the different departments of the store. This would mean that we could have also more capable and fewer hourly workers, and thus decrease the headcount and maybe even increase wages. Having done that structure, we could model the productivity that would be required in terms of sales and movement of goods through the store, and whether that organization could handle that. We could then calculate the costs and then understand the sales that we would need to generate to support that new structure. Another thing that I think is important is that this stresses the importance of HR in building a supply chain and delivering a professional, committed staff to that organization. So the first bullet on the right-hand side is organization. The next one focuses a great deal on the supply chain aspects. And then we can develop a highly capable management group for the management area and engagement, leading to self-managed work groups, and using technology to drive a lot of the administrative aspects of the workforce. Finally, we need to evaluate and measure the success. So what I'm trying to do in this case is synopsize what we mean by workforce analytics and how it can help understand how to change the model and renew and regenerate a much more effective company and set of processes. This is not just a simple tale that's made out of whole cloth. This actually has some parallels. These are a tale of two stores in very similar markets. So one of the things we controlled for when we did this analysis was, what are the markets and are they selling the same things to the same types of people? And we found two different organizations within this particular national chain. One that was staffed with its stereotypical 150 people with very low wages, lack a not stable workforce at all. Basically, the capabilities were not there. They were part-timers, students, and a lot of transients. The roles were really narrowly defined so they could be easily learned, and the organization required a hierarchy of managers, as I described. And HR basically did hiring and handled some union issues, but the training and most of it was performed by managers, and including the hiring. All that HR did was provide the kind of guidelines that hiring should take. And they weren't very productive. They were only selling $120 of goods per hour, labor hour. Contrast to a store that had solved the problems the way I just described on the previous slide. And what we found was that wages were much higher, the workforce was much stabler, they were much more capable and professional. The roles were broad, and so that people could be used in a variety of different ways and flexibly. The organization was flat, and authority was pushed down and distributed. There was a small, highly trained, effective regional HR function to support a number of stores that could do the hiring and the training and the management development that this required. But the revenue was much higher and could pay for all of those additional things and actually make a higher profit. So by looking at the things that we described, the organization, the supply chain, the management, and by innovating, this store became much more profitable overall. Again, stressing organization, human capital supply chain, management, and innovation. And I'll get to why I labeled it evaluation and adaptation in a bit. So let's go into each of the subcomponents and talk about a few things, what it is, and then what questions are associated with it. First, organizational analytics really has 4 components to it. The business strategy. So this basically says, what are we in business to do, and what is the implications of that as we fulfill our markets, and what do we have to do to execute that business strategy effectively? That gets translated into a business model or an organizational model, and basically has standardized processes and technologies and a work environment and an organizational structure that clearly is defined. But what happens in many places is a disconnect. So finance, marketing, operations, IT on the left-hand side, and then human resources tends to collect what's thrown over that wall, that ratio wall. And then it's up to them to define the roles, and oftentimes the roles are defined already by the operations people. But they have to find the people with the capabilities at the right costs. They have to develop performance measures, and they have to understand the critical skills and hire for those. Finally, they have to establish work standards, which not only deal with the pay that people get and the performance that they get, but the career progression. So what are the qualities of people that we need, and what standards and are we going to hold them to effectively? Now, one of the disjoints that I've seen, and this is all too often, is that this work is done in silos. So finance and marketing and operations determine the strategy and throw it over the wall. And then, as I said, HR is forced to react to it effectively. But I'd like to do another case briefly here. And this has to do with an oil field foreman's position. Finance and IT and operations understood that it was not performing well, and it had to revive and renew the performance and increase the performance that was happening in its upstream oil field. And so what they did was they developed a very good balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard basically looked at things that hadn't been done before but needed to be. Like, how can we do preventative maintenance and measure it? How can we hold down costs? How can we increase safety training? But because it was balanced, there was no particular, key measure. It was left, once this was introduced, to the oil field foreman to balance the decisions between servicing a pump or going into overtime or holding someone out for training and causing his other workers to get overtime. The oil field foreman up to this point had been a good old boys who were really hardworking and very committed to the company, would work late at night and get things done, but they were reactive. They weren't proactive. And they really didn't know optimization. And they really had their priorities set centrally. Now they were given a balanced scorecard and optimization tools that they had to struggle with those at the oil field level, where before it hadn't been their job to do it before. It completely changed the job of the oil field foreman. It required them to make decisions that they hadn't been used to. It gave priorities that were unclear to them, and those priorities would change with the cost of oil. So as they reacted to this, they essentially rejected it. But it could have been avoided. That rejection could have been avoided if the HR function had done some really good analysis and been asked to do some analysis on how radically the job had changed and what the new requirements would be in order to effectively accomplish that new organization, use the new technology effectively. And unfortunately, most of the foremen did not want to engage in the new effort because they were happy and wanted to continue doing what they had done and done well for the preceding years. So the new way of looking at this is not to separate it. It's to get the analysis of the organizations and the impact on people and jobs combined with the construction of the operation model. That is a much better way of approaching this problem. And in doing that, organizational analytics really has to answer, and these are only some of the questions. If you have an existing organization, what are my people doing? And this really uses activity-based surveys. So from this slide, we'll talk about the questions, and in the left-hand side, or right-hand side, you'll see the analytical techniques that companies are using now to solve these problems. So what can be eliminated and automated and outsourced and reorganized? That's really cluster analysis and network analysis to understand how we can recombine activities more effectively. What should the organization look like? Organizational design driven by scenarios and workload projection. So if I start to understand how I can restructure work more effectively, how do I just structure authority and processes within that? And how much work can that new organization process handle, and how many people am I going to need to do that? What are the capabilities needed by workers who will occupy those positions in the newly organized positions? So this is a capability framework. What are they going to cost me? So this is where compensation comes in. And how do I accurately assess someone to have those skills, whether those are from the outside or internal to the organization? So this is how a lot of what people think of the main function of HR starts to connect effectively to the business, and how we can measure its effectiveness in terms of its delivery to the business. Then that switches, having established that organization, that switches us to human capital supply chain analytics. So once we know the organization and the workload it can handle, we can actually do a demand forecast. We can say, how much are we going to sell in the next year? And if we change technology, what impact might that have on the numbers of people that we would need and the skills that they would have? So we can do that through scenario analysis. Then, once having established the need, we can look at the supply forecast, both within the company. So how many people are going to not only leave the company, but also be promoted and acquire different jobs, and by leaving the job that they're in, cause an opening that has to take place. That will give us essentially a projection of the supply. Then we can look very effectively at comparing the demand and supply and resolve what will inevitably be the surpluses and shortfalls. And here comes basically an optimization process to maximize how those workers are assigned to meet the new work that's required. And what is the most effective way to deal with the surpluses? For instance, is it layoffs? Is it training? Is it using less or more qualified people in roles that they might not be suited for? And how to deal with shortfalls. Is it hiring? Is it training? Is it contractors or temporaries? After that analysis, that optimization analysis, we can start to look at building an inventory and maintaining that inventory of the required workers that we're going to need over time. And that could be through acquisition, a combination of things, acquisition of either full-time or part-time people or contractors. We could develop them. We could use transfers effectively. We could lay off the people who would not be appropriate and not be able to fill new positions or just be in the wrong geographic area. So those are the kinds, that becomes a set of mechanisms to meet the new human capital plan. And that allows us to put the right people in the right jobs at the right time and cost. And finally, having built that inventory, we have to allocate them. So oftentimes there are competing demands for the same people. So how do we allocate them to the proper places where they earn the most money for the business? This is really a portfolio analysis process. And then finally, we do an evaluation of whether or not this whole human capital supply chain is working effectively, and how to improve it. Where are we falling short? What needs to be changed? And oftentimes it's not within the human resource area. It's that the marketing projections are wrong, or that the technology didn't have as much benefit as it was thought. So it also forces HR and finance and operations and IT to become much more tightly integrated as we look at the causes for where this might be falling short. And then here are the questions that we've reviewed, but it also looks very much at the analytics. So we use stochastic modeling for looking at the supply and demand for workers. We need visibility into the external workforce and contractors, which is a new database and needs a way of being made aware so HR can respond more effectively. We need to understand through scenario planning, how to combine projections of marketing demands and technology and process. We need optimization of costs and benefits of all the different solutions for developing that human capital plan that I described earlier. We need essentially processes of monitoring, and this is where really performance indicators start to come in. So how long does it take to fill positions? How many open positions? Are we seeing increases in overtime or decreases in customer service? And that allows us to start to understand whether the inventory is right and where it's failing. And finally, allocation, and that's really daily scheduling optimization. Or for research and development groups within companies, it could be portfolio optimization. So what am I developing and where do I need to spend my human capital effectively to optimize what's going to happen in the future? And so finally, we now look at engagement and innovation. And that really is much more focused on managers and managers' execution. Managers now have to understand the organization that they're managing and the people that they're being given. And to do that, they really have to have a set of tools. They have to understand how to assess people, their capabilities, how to measure their performance, how to use rewards effectively, not just monetary rewards, but more importantly, how to fulfill their workers' needs, to let them know and how they're doing, to tell them that the manager cares about how they're doing, and to enable the manager to have coaching conversations and understand how to develop those workers. Because in many respects, in all of our research, it is those activities, not financial, that really form the glue and motivate people effectively. When all of those parts are working together, you get engagement and you get profitability. When they're not, you get a very disaffected workforce and you have losses. Now, as the subtitle says, unfortunately, a lot of my clients call me at this point, not to design organizations up front, not to anticipate the human supply chain, but only after things have failed. And that's really kind of sad. And what we do here is really focus on a number of different levels and a number of different data analytics. And I'll get to those on the next page. So the first thing that we look at, and the companies look at generally now very well, is the business meeting or exceeding or failing short of its goal. So analysis of key performance indicators is usually one of the ways, and it's the first warning sign, in fact, or the first green light that says everything's working well. It's that analysis where things are not working well that tends to starts to ask questions of the workforce and how it's being managed effectively. So the next area is the analysis of key human capital management performance indicators. So the organizational design, human capital supply chain, the rewards, the performance measures, are all those working effectively? And so we start to then say, well, is there an association between either success or failure at those and success or failure of the company? And that's really a study of the timing and strength of the correlations of how well the human capital measures are working with the performance measures of the overall company. But it also sets into motion the development of some hypotheses for some more focused work that can ask and answer some questions that the raw data can't. So oftentimes this requires surveys, engagement surveys in particular. And these are surveys designed not so much as metrics, but to understand causal relationships. We also look at employing statistical modeling of that data that we collect in the surveys to understand the reasons for success and failure. And I can give you a great example of how this worked, and it's in the book. It's in the engagement section of the book. We once were faced with a really interesting problem. It was for a call center. Some wag has called call centers the modern-day equivalent to Dickensian workshops. They have high turnover, relatively low wages, a lot of pressure under performance. And so they're interesting to study, and if people can get it right, have great benefit. So we were asked to look at the performance of a series of call centers in the communications industry. And what we found was very interesting. In terms of the key performance indicators for the corporation, they were horrible. Sales were down, customer satisfaction was down, dropped calls were up, productivity was down. So it was clear that something was wrong. And something was wrong with the outcome measures that were in the call center. But we took a look at the human capital performance indicators and how things were working and what they had done. And this particular group had done a great deal of work, and really good work, at defining the jobs that were being done, at aligning selection processes to effectively hire people with those capabilities. The workforce seemed to be available where they had structured their call centers, so that wasn't a problem. The organization design seemed to be okay. The measures were wonderful. There was a balanced scorecard measure. Every month, the people would be measured on dropped calls, on customer satisfaction, on the numbers of sales, and they would each individual would get a composite score. And the managers seemed to be enforcing that fairly well. The turnover rate on a monthly basis for poor performers was 3 times higher than good performers. And that went on forever. But when we looked at it over time, and specifically on a cohort basis, we found that new hire performance, which should have been the worst, was equivalent to the performance of people who had been there 12 months, who presumably had undergone all of the efforts of management to improve the population of workers by getting rid of poor workers and rewarding good workers. So we had to do a survey, and a very targeted survey, at understanding how managers were acting and at how the call center operators were perceiving what was going on around them. And what we found was really interesting. Ultimately, the performance metrics were failing. And they were failing for 2 basic reasons. And by the way, the workers felt very abused by this. The failure happened because marketing in an effort to compete with other companies was constantly changing the products and services that were available to the customers of this company. So that meant that the call center operators had to learn almost every month a new set of programs and pricing structures, while all of the other programs and pricing structures that were under contract were being maintained. So it made it very difficult, and the technology did not keep up with it effectively. But the other kicker in this was something that no one expected. The manager's scorecard was based in part on the performance of their groups. And they were rewarded for the proportion of their group that made its metrics, under the idea that if you rewarded a manager for improving the performance of their workers, they would spend effort to develop and increase that performance, and that would be captured in the metric of the proportion of people who met their metrics within their teams. Unfortunately, 80% of the managers found an easy way to solve that problem. It didn't require a lot of work. As they recorded the performance of their workers over the month, they would literally fire the people who weren't meeting those metrics for whatever reason. And that meant by the end of the month, a high proportion of their team would have met its metric. So a measure that had been intended to be very positive and very much associated with increased performance turned out to encourage 80% of the managers to take an easy way out and merely eliminate their problems instead of dealing with them. The interesting thing was that the managers who sacrificed monthly performance in this group were the ones whose teams were the highest performing. The individuals in the team were on average higher, but the overall team performance, the cumulative aspects of the team performance was higher. And what was interesting was that for every month of service that the team, on average, the team had, they sold $100,000 more in services and products on a monthly basis. So in this case, when managers were sacrificing their own short-term performance, they actually increased the longevity and the capabilities of their workers by ignoring the short-term performance of those workers and by rewarding the long-term performance. Now that required some work on our part and some very clever regression and causal analysis to understand effectively. So having set that up, I'd like to now go into comparisons of big data and workforce analytics. And first, let me review workforce analytics. In this case, what we have been talking about through all of the case studies and actually through all of the examples, and this is throughout the book, that we really stress this. It's really a six-step process. It's how do you frame a problem? How do you understand the central issue that you're dealing with? Too many times companies run off and try to solve a problem before they understand it. Then to take that problem and say, how can we solve that problem? What are the things that could affect the outcomes that we're looking at? Then can we collect the data relevant for that? Most of the times it's available within the databases, but a lot of times you're going to have to create it yourself. And you're going to have to build it to answer the particular question. Then we have to apply analytical methods. And the analytical methods can be simple. They could be cross-steps or simple correlations. But increasingly, they're going to be very sophisticated regression, stochastic modeling, linear programming, and optimization models that really require some work and some professional skill to handle. That will give you a result, but then it's important to test that result with stakeholders. So if they don't understand it, and if they don't feel they can act on it and work effectively to solve their problems, or the cost of the solution that you're suggesting from the model is too much, or the benefit is too small, stakeholders will understand that and let you know it. then you can refine what you've done and then develop action steps to implement the solution. So this is really the core of the analytical process. And it is basically the scientific method combined with business value to guide and help benefit the overall corporation. Now, how does big data fit with this? Well, I think big data has some very attractive parts to it, and they've really informed us about things that have blinded activity in the past. But on the other hand, one of my big objections to them is that correlation is good enough. And when I go back, and I have a background in science and mathematics, and I look at what one of the statements that was made by big data is that 90% prediction is good enough. When you look at Copernicus and understand the movement from Earth-centered view of the world to a solar-centered view of the world and the universe, the measurement errors that Copernicus was using were far less than 10%. But it forced him to reconceive of the concepts, of the precepts, of how the physics of the universe worked. And that led to calculus. It led to Newtonian mechanics. It allows us to have a space program. It allows us to put satellites into orbit to understand and control weather and communications better. It is the principles and the why that Copernicus found from the errors that was important, not ignoring them. Now, big data actually has, I think, 4 fundamental precepts, many of which apply when you are reacting to a trend and not in control of it. So take advantage of billions of records and huge amounts of data. I think that is, the examples I give are numerous, and it's really wonderful. Twitter does this now very effectively. But it's not controlling. HR information is relatively small, though, and even companies with 100,000 employees or more really don't have the same reservoirs of big data that really is required to use some of the principles involved here. So we target data. We see they see no need for small samples or subsets. But we actually create small targeted databases that contain meaningful measures, in part because of cost, but in part because that's really all we need to do, is focus on a particular problem and collect relevant measures for them. It embraces messy data and gives up striving for exactitude. From an analyst point of view, I can deal with a certain amount of data, but for managers that use my analysis, I have to be right. I have to be accurate. The managers have to be confident that when I tell them that this is the person they need to go talk to and why they need to go talk to that person or that group of people, that they are actually reporting to that person and that they are representative of the group that needs to have some action done for them. Without that exactitude, managers will distrust the information that I'm giving them. And then finally, settling for correlations and giving up causation. Managers really need to act, and they must have confidence that if I do this, it will get me this much, or this will happen. It will have a desired effect. Managing people requires knowing why and how to take advantage of that understanding and of that cause. And so there is a difference between big data and what we're describing here. They're not in conflict. I really appreciate many of the things that big data have. But it is this disciplined process that I think can work best when we're managing people and managing small groups within people. And most work groups or business units are fairly small. Thank you. I'll turn this back over to Lisa.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hoffmann. We do have some questions here for you. We'll start with one that zeroes in on that key ratio that you had toward the beginning of the deck. To your point of increasing revenue and holding labor costs, why not express that inversely so that it's total revenue per cost of labor as you've got it on the Tale of Two Stores slide?
I would be happy to turn it on its head. In most of the companies I work with, the view is the proportion of revenue that is labor, but I would rather have the other way myself. Yes,
the person who raised the question thought that it seemed like a more positive way of framing it.
Yes.
To what extent did you look at the customer base for the two stores in the Tale of Two Stores case study? Did you look at average age, median income, cost of living, and so on, and how all that affects the available workforce and business results?
Yes, as much as possible. So, we looked at traffic patterns around the stores. We looked at the socioeconomic levels of the surrounding zip codes and areas. So we tried to and we did look at age profiles. We tried to hold those as constant as possible. And they were in those two stores, they were very much like.
Mm-hmm. Can you say more about what managerial capabilities, particularly in line management, are needed to support the analytics-driven programs that you're describing?
I think that's a really good question. I like it a lot. The managers don't need to be analysts. The analysts and the statisticians do. They need to talk to each other. So the capabilities are translating the numbers so they make sense to the manager. I think that they have to have some level of abstraction. So going back to the oil field foreman, there has to be some ability to take facts and understand cause and effect in them. Mm-hmm. But they should not be doing analysis. They should be making decisions based upon the parameters that the analyst has developed.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're pitching workplace analytics services, is there a typical buyer within HR, for example, or operations or finance? Who's your customer?
Customer is usually someone in operations or finance, occasionally in HR. The HR function may not even know that there's a problem because a lot of the reporting tools and a lot of the strategy and IT is devoted to finance. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily that HR doesn't want to be in this and wouldn't want to call me. What happens usually is that that wall that I put up in one of the early slides involving organizations exists, and I am much more likely to be called by an operations person or by a finance person. Yeah.
And to what extent is the use of workforce data limited by privacy laws and the like?
It's limited. It can be handled in several ways. I'm working with a very large global financial institution now that's building a global database. And they have gone through different works councils to get releases of information, not identified information, but enough at an aggregate level that I can use it fairly well for analytical purposes.
Sure.
Then the translation becomes a little more difficult because you have to then go into each of the countries and deal with it on a much more focused basis.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your framework, the first step is frame the central problem, and then you have the relevant data tucked down a couple of steps below that. To what extent should companies be using data to frame the problem to begin with and to zero in on what actually needs fixing?
Well, in fact, they are. In the kind of engagement level where I'm talking about key performance indicators, where we're really starting from a data-driven process that recognizes that there's a problem. Those are always usually the start of it. It's not a hypothetical problem. So companies do use that quite effectively to recognize problems. It's whether they have the data and the analytical skills to understand the cause and the solution to that problem.
Yep. And can you go into a bit more detail about using scenarios and workload projections to rethink how work gets done? Perhaps walk us through a brief example? Sure.
One of the things that I really like is IBM did this fairly well. In the consulting group, we would actually kind of project the number and types of jobs that we would have over the next year or two. Now, we knew from experience the kind of staffing models that would be associated with each type of engagement. So by projecting those engagements, or projecting the staffing for those engagements by the number of engagements we were going to sell, we could pretty much understand what the demand of the labor force for labor over the next year. The interesting thing is that we would go through variations like, well, what if this changes and what if that changes? And look at the impact on the overall staffing models. And one of the curious things that we found was that as long as there was not a radically new technology, the labor force that was required, depending upon a variety of different scenarios, was fairly stable, which was kind of nice to know ahead of time. But there were cases like when outsourcing happened, when a whole new set of skills would have to be, and a new ways of processes that would then project a very different demand and supply ratio for the new skills.
Mm-hmm. And in sizing up competencies, how can companies go about measuring people's softer skills like communication and collaboration to determine if they're the right fit for the job at hand?
I think connecting those to assessments, and they don't necessarily have to be yearly, but when you see someone, are they giving presentations effectively? What's the quality of their report writing? Are they reaching out? I mean, reaching out to their coworkers to maximize the information that they have to make decisions or to inform them effectively. Those are the kinds of things that managers should be observing, that social media can actually help in terms of network analysis, understand, and provide better insight into as well. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, building behavioral measures that can be observed and rated is how you would probably track the development of those activities within your workforce.
Okay. Well, I think, we have one more question, if you can very quickly address it. What's your view on worker satisfaction in all this? It was touched on just very indirectly.
Workers, yeah.
How to measure it.
You gave me probably the longest question to answer at the end.
It came in last.
Okay. I think engagement's different from satisfaction. If my needs are being met, so if I know what I'm supposed to do, if that's clear to me, if I'm given the tools to do it, if I'm rewarded for it actively, and if my manager is giving me the information that I need to improve my work, I think that is a satisfied worker. If I give them a Likert item scale that says from 1 to 5, are you happy? I may get a very different response than the answer to those 4 more behaviorally oriented questions.
Sure.
Okay?
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. Sorry to throw that one at you last. I'd like to thank Carl Hoffmann very much for sharing his insights today, and also thank our audience for joining us. And thanks to Workday for making this discussion possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.